Hello, everyone. Welcome to our penultimate episode of Bios and Bookmarks powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I am Shivani Ramlochan, and I am delighted to be joined today by Donna Hemans. Donna, welcome so much to the Bios and Bookmarks family.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we're here today to talk about and to hear Donna read from her fascinating and I might just say possibly the best book club selection book of the year from all feedback indicated novel, Tea by the Sea from Hen Press. It's Donna's second novel. And without further ado, I'm going to invite her to share her first reading from Tea by the Sea. Donna, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So Tea by the Sea is the story of a young mother who spent 17 years searching for her child who was taken from her at birth. And what I will read from are I'll read from the first chapter, which begins with Lenworth, the father of the child, and then I'll pick up the second portion of this with Plum's version. Lenworth was back on the main road to Anchovy proper, past Long Hill's deep ravines and its corners and its peak, and long past the canopy of trees that shaded the steep road snaking up from the coast. He was on foot this time, with the baby in the crook of one arm and an oversized bag that he pulled with the other hand. Having mistaken one house on a hill for the one he sought, he was lost, and the driver who had taken him there had already left. On that stretch of road, without the towering trees, the sun's heat was like a glove on his body, too close and too heavy, and the sweat dribbling along his spine and in every crevice more of an annoyance than a cooling mechanism. He worried about the baby and the heat, whether she was too young to be so exposed to the elements. Still, he kept her covered under a thin blanket. Thin socks covered her toes. The car ride had lulled her to sleep, and she slept as if she had already grown accustomed to the sounds around her. A cow mooing in the distance, a dog's disinterested bark followed by the growl of another, a couple of goat kids maying nearby, and honks from a vehicle that navigated the hilly road's deep corners. Since she was quiet, Lenworth suspected she was comfortable, and he willed her to remain that way, at least until they got to the house which he imagined couldn't be too far away. The road had widened and flattened, and to his left were the abandoned railway tracks. That was his mistake. Having sat for 2 hours already in the car, he had simply wanted to be at the house on the hill and had forgotten the written instructions to turn left at the junction where the tracks crossed the main road, directly in front of the secondary school with the blue and white walls. Now he watched for the point where the tracks began curving toward the main road and an unpaved road to the left of the railroad crossing. He watched for the vehicles approaching from behind and passing on his right, turning to face the road each time a vehicle approached. He was careful not to brush up against the hip-high fever grass with its long, sharp blades, or the patches of cowish that would surely leave temporary welts on any exposed skin. Had it been another time, he would have pulled a handful of the stringy love bush and twirled the thin yellow strands of the parasitic vine around his fingers. He loved the rubbery feel of it, how easily it snapped apart in his hands. Yet it was sturdy and resilient, able to regenerate itself from just a small piece. The ground was hot. So heated the asphalt had softened and bubbled in places. The ordinariness of it all, the late summer afternoon's heat softening the asphalt, the sounds of natural life itself persevering, comforted him. He needed the comfort, for there was nothing ordinary or comforting about what had led him to that road on that day. But he wouldn't think about that. Not then, not there. At last, he saw the point at which the railroad tracks crossed the main road. He saw the school, children in uniform, the open field next to the school. Further up that unpaved road another fork, the nurse's house with a scrolled iron gate, and finally the overgrown yard behind a cut stone wall. At the gate were two letters, an M and an O, the only remnants of the name someone had once given the property. Upon the hill was the abandoned house, a small and compact building that looked like it grew out of the side of a cliff. There was nothing elegant about the house. Two concrete columns that were once painted white held up a small veranda and framed a door to a cellar. To the right of the columns, a set of concrete steps rose up to the red floor of the veranda and the aqua railing that hemmed it in. The back of the house jutted out of the hillside, or so it seemed. The kitchen and dining room backed up to a small cliff, with only a sliver of space between the walls and the cliff in which ferns and moss grew. The rooms, three if he counted only the distinct ones, or four if he counted the space in the middle with a curtain for a wall, were small, but the house would do. And despite the duck ants that formed black nests along the walls, the rotten floorboards he would have to replace, and the temperamental plumbing and electrical work, the house would be his refuge. So I'm going to switch now to Plum's perspective, and this picks up when she also discovers that Lenworth is missing. Indeed, Plum looked for Lenworth. She returned to their small cottage on property that at one time had been a large pimento and cattle estate. The pimento and the cattle were long gone, the surrounding land subdivided and developed as residential plots. All that was left of the estate were the cottage and the larger house, which from the outside looked like it would crumble without much prompting from a single puff of wind, then decay. But it was only an illusion. Inside was an artist's dream. Every inch of wood on the floor and the ceiling had been replaced with hand-sanded and hand-carved mahogany. The plaster walls had been rebuilt with new concrete walls, which were painted a light cocoa, orange, and green, the paint brushed on to make the walls look as distressed as the outer perimeter of the house. Necessary modern conveniences were interspersed with remnants from another time, enamel bowls, yabbas, and shutters that banged in the breeze. On her return, Plum passed the main house with its front walkway flanked by two large monkey jars, flowering bougainvillea and hibiscus, and dwarfed by the flame of the forest trees behind it, both in full bloom. The flowering plants, with their red and pink and yellow blooms celebrating life, taunted and teased, made tears flood Plum's eyes again. She walked past the house to the cottage in the back and found the rooms had been stripped of Lenworth's things, his CDs and books and papers and clothes. He didn't have much, but everything belonging to him was gone. Plum's clothes hanging in the wardrobe were meager, forlorn, and childish, a reminder that she had only just begun her adult life. Plum ran back out, tottered really, and found her landlady, Mrs. Murray, the artist who had given new life to the decrepit and rundown historic house. "Look at you," Mrs. Murray said. She held out her hands, palms upward and fingers splayed, surprise and joy in her voice. "Have you seen him?" Plum asked. "Lenworth? No. He's gone." "What you mean gone?" The levity in Mrs. Murray's voice was absent now. She looked over Plum with one sweeping glance, capturing Plum's heavy breast and swollen belly and the distraught look on her face. She caught Plum before she fell, held her up, linked their arms, and walked her back to the cottage. Inside the cottage, Plum lay on the floor and bawled, rocking and heaving on the ground like a Pentecostal possessed by the Holy Spirit, throwing off the landlady attempting to hold and calm her. When she had no tears or sobs left to pour out and no strength to stand up, she knelt and looked around at the borrowed furniture that came with the cottage, then stood and looked around again for something of Lenworth's, a handwritten explanation, a clue to where he had gone and why. But she found nothing, no sign that he had lived there at all. Had it not been for her breasts, achingly full, it would have all felt like a miserable dream, a nightmare that Plum wasn't actually living, and from which she would wake at any minute. Neither had words for what had happened. Lenworth was gone, and so was her child, the daughter she had planned to name Marissa. They let the silence steep. For Plum, the quiet was less painful than the sounds of life, the twitter and buzz of bees, the swish of leaves, the wind in the trees, a donkey braying in the distance. Mrs. Murray's lone parrot, which had escaped its cage again, cawed incessantly, taunting them from a guava tree. "I hate that bird." Plum did the only thing she could in that moment. She stepped outside, picked up a small stone, and threw it at the parrot, forgetting that its wings had been clipped to prevent it from flying away. The parrot flitted from one limb to another, cocked its head, and repeated what Lenworth had taught it. 1 + 1 = 2. It paused, then said, "Lenworth, leave the bird alone," repeating the two phrases exactly how it had heard them. Day after day, Lenworth had stood by the parrot's cage, feeding it dried corn and repeating 1 + 1 = 2, with the expectation that the bird would fool an unsuspecting stranger into thinking it could count. And Plum, if she was nearby, always told Lenworth to leave the bird alone. But the joke was now an unwanted reminder of what had been. Plum reached for another larger stone. Come, come," Mrs. Murray Mrs. Murray pulled Plum's hand back. Don't mix my bird up in this business with you and him. Come lay down and rest. I'm going to make you some soup, and when you wake up, we'll figure this out. Now stop there.
Wow. Thank you so much for that reading, Donna.
Thanks.
As I mentioned to Donna just before we went live, Tea by the Sea is that extraordinary kind of book that seems to take by the wrist so many themes all at once: issues of colorism, of abandonment, of immigration, misogyny, revenge, matriarchal devotion. And there are many levels at which all these themes are at work and present in Tea by the Sea. But Donna, because the first instance of your reading deals so strongly with houses, with the built structures we surround ourselves with for protection, which often offer no protection at all, I thought we could begin our talk by speaking of houses, which, according to one of the characters in the novel who says this quite movingly at a certain point, that houses have the ability to tell stories. And then so much that goes unsaid can be found within the structure of a house. How important was it for you to explore our built heritage through houses in the novel?
Well, the actual house in Tea by the Sea that Lenworth goes to is my grandparents' house. And one of the things that I wanted to do was in some ways kind of try to sort of preserve that house in fiction.
Mhm.
And I think it's one of those things where I had gone to Jamaica sometime back, and a few years back, and I had, we pulled up in front of the house, and the bush was, like pretty high, and the house was just sitting there, and it looked, just lonely. And, it was just one of those things where I immediately thought that this house is not going to be with us forever. And, certainly, of course, it's one of those things where my father and his siblings have to think about what they're going to do with it, because it's theirs now and they will not be with us forever. But one of the other things that I've always also thought about is that this was the first house that my grandparents were able to buy. And I'm not sure exactly what year they bought it, but they were born in the late 1800s. And if you think about just the time period, that was not very far removed from slavery.
Mhm.
And for them to have been able to buy something, to build something, to have something for themselves at that time is just really important to me and significant to me. And so in some ways, whether that house is there with us, physically here with us always, I wanted to look at writing about it in this way as a way to preserve it.
It's fascinating to think about the significance of that house compared to some of the structures that we meet in Brooklyn, like the brownstones, even the structures that are not meant for permanent human habitation, like the significance of some public spaces like Coney Island, for example.
Mhm.
I mean, there is a way in which the characters move through worlds that both feel like home and also feel far away from home. I found myself thinking a lot about what home means to Plum, what home means to Lenworth, what home means to Pauline, and how these characters work so hard in their own ways to preserve a sense of coming home, of searching for home, of trying to stand on their own 2 feet in very different ways. And so I'm very curious about, and this might be a bit of a cheeky question, if there is any character's search for home or quest for home with which you most strongly identify.
Um, Probably all of them in some ways, and I think it's just my personal quest. And
Mhm.
I grew up in Jamaica. I left Jamaica when I was 16, and I lived in New York for about 8 years. I now live in Maryland. And it's one of the questions that I always ask myself is, where exactly is home? Where do I belong? I've spent most of my life outside of Jamaica, but I still very strongly identify with Jamaica as home. And it's a question that I'm not sure if and when I'll ever fully answer that, until I like move somewhere nice and warm. But I think, when you look at Plum in particular, I think hers probably more closely aligns with mine in some ways, in that she, well, not fully, but in very small ways. Plum, her parents sent her back to Jamaica to finish high school. And so she then experiences Jamaica initially as a foreigner, but it becomes home. Then she leaves Jamaica, she comes back to Brooklyn, but leaves Jamaica not necessarily under the best of circumstances. So for her, Jamaica then is a negative place. But you don't necessarily see that throughout the story, because she goes back and she is looking at it as a very different place, because she's searching for something. But Brooklyn, when she comes back to Brooklyn, what she's seeing is Brooklyn now as a stranger. And
Hmm.
this place that she believed that she would not have wanted to leave becomes, in some ways, almost like a negative space. And so, she has a real question to answer: where exactly does she belong? And I'm not sure that she fully understands it, because for her, home, it seems, is not necessarily a physical place as much as it is the people with that she is with. And that I think is her search. And it might very well be all of our, the search that we all end up on. Is home physical, really, or is it something that you create wherever you are with the people you're with?
Yeah, I so appreciate that the novel itself is offering itself as a vehicle to try to contend with these questions. What I think moves me deeply about Tea by the Sea is that, without wanting to give anything away, I'm going to be very careful in how I phrase this. People who are really fond of seamless and tidy and perfect narratives in their fiction may walk away from Tea by the Sea unsatisfied. Like, if you are looking for a color by the numbers, things fitting into a jigsaw puzzle, and everything is tidy and works out just fine, I would say beware. But still read it, because the questions you go into the novel thinking you will have about the child being found and about these very specific issues of identity and parenthood, will those be answered? I think yes and no. The novel reveals there are things that are beyond our initial understanding of ourselves. Where do we come from? Where are we going? How can we say we're making the best decisions for our children? Who are we betraying? And are we betraying ourselves in the cost for success? And I think about those things a lot in relation to the book. And I think in line with that, I really want to know if the struggles of the characters, because certainly they're all contending with things that are troubling them deeply throughout their lives,
Mhm.
was it ever a real challenge to carry those struggles as a person setting them down on paper, and as those struggles evolved and took on a life of their own?
I think yes. I mean, it certainly was a struggle, and a lot of that really has to do with the way in which I write. Because normally, when I write something, I have a vague sense of where I'm going, and I don't necessarily know how I'll get there. And so for me as a writer, the struggle really is figuring out what happens next and why these various things happen. And as I, began developing Lenworth as a character, and this is a person who I don't know. I think I've met one person who liked Lenworth or who empathized with Lenworth, and that might be it. I don't know if there are any others, but I think it required um, a lot of effort to make sure that he was not presented as only a negative
Mhm.
person. And I think that's the struggle that every writer has, or should have at least, is that characters are not, or people are not one dimensional.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I wanted to do is that, Lenworth does this really horrible thing at the, we when we meet him, he has stolen his child and taken this baby away from her mother. And the problem that I had was trying to figure out how exactly to make him to make his decision a worthwhile decision, or to in some ways present it as if it was a worthwhile decision, because I wanted him to be not this person you just outright hate, but that in some ways you know, as a reader, struggle with whether or not you empathize with him or understand. You might not like him in the end, but I wanted people to at least understand why he did it.
I mean, I have to tell you that spending time with Lenworth has been some of the most simultaneously frustrating and rewarding time I've spent with any fictional character this year. I mean, as you
Okay.
Tea by the Sea opens on the act of what you think is unforgivable, the stealing of a child, and the complete stripping of agency of the mother of
Hmm.
that child, which is, I think, one of the novel's aching tragedies. But alongside that, I mean, I could never have predicted feeling this, especially towards the last third of Tea by the Sea. This very profound empathy for Lenworth and the deep interiority that you get into his character. This sense of how many of his dreams have been thwarted and
Right.
how agonizing that's been for him. And also, albeit with great flaws, how much he in his own way has tried to consider Plum, has tried to think about what she would be feeling or doing, and his own very mangled affections for her. I mean, we see these things through the lens of an omniscient reader,
Right.
having a sense of our sympathies being where they are. I mean, would I wave a flag saying Team Lenworth? I don't know, but it's like you say, I can't leave the novel thinking he's a complete villain.
Right. And that's good, because I want us, our readers, to really be able to think about it, to think about even our own actions, because I think there are things that we do, mistakes that we make, each of us, but we're not necessarily, or not always, making the mistakes or making these horrible decisions because we are, I mean, because you know, we're doing it because we're mean. Our intentions are sometimes good, the actions themselves are not necessarily the best, but you know, if the intention is good, I think it's easier to understand that person than if you're just simply doing something because you're mean spirited.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are ways in which you could say TBC functions as a morality lesson, but the morals are not straightforward. They're not black and white.
Yeah.
They're not wholesale. I mean, there are people you're going to strongly align with at the beginning of the book, and that might change in small, kind of unsettling ways as the narrative progresses.
Right.
I spent, I mean, as much time as I spent trying to understand Lenworth, I certainly spent an equal amount of time trying to really feel Plum's journey, Plum's sense of, on the one hand, as so much time passes, as one
Hmm.
year turns into 5, turns into 10 with no clear answers about the child,
Hmm.
how does a person reconcile themselves to the idea of you can perhaps build a normal life out of this loss and console yourself with a sort of comfort, but there is always a part of you that is forever searching and wondering and hoping. And I wanted to know what it was like to write that the fine line between trying to reconcile yourself on the one hand,
Hmm.
but then perhaps knowing on the other hand you never really can when it is your child that's on the line.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of Plum's struggle is also tied to the issue of abandonment. And for her, when her parents sent her back to Jamaica to finish school, she thought of that as her parents abandoning her. And then she meets Lenworth, and he takes off with her child, and she again feels abandoned. So for her, part of the struggle is not just finding the child, but if and when she did find the child, what kind of a reunion would she have with her child? Would she be again abandoned by this person who she never raised? And I think it's a very real question, because you as a well, Plum herself encountered all of these various things, these various setbacks, and she had to struggle with figuring out how to really carry on with her life. And it's a struggle that plays out in a relationship she has with the man she eventually marries, Alan. And I think even in just the way they're, she danced around letting him know, or getting to the point where she wanted to marry him, because she really didn't want to set herself up for him doing the same thing as Lenworth had done. And when she does indeed does eventually marry him, she does it on her terms, because she is the one who finally says, okay, I'm ready now. He doesn't necessarily understand why or what had happened before, and she doesn't tell him what had happened to this earlier child. But a lot of it is her relationship to that new husband, and her relationship to the two daughters who she has with him is just really based on what happened to her in her very early relationship. And I don't think that was something that she really would have been able to get over.
No, it's something that captivates me about the book is how the decisions of other people, completely external to you, can force you to create this web of secrecy in your own life, and how the idea of there not ever being just one clear secret either. You have secrets that are held within secrets and concealments and things that characters are longing to confess and never can. Like Plum talks about how Alan doesn't know the significance of a certain date in her life
Mhm.
to her, and how there is you're navigating all these selves, the self that you present even to the people who come to love you dearly. And then there is that self that is so denied of the thing or person that it deserves, that it creates a secret world to live in with that pain. And what was it like, navigating these characters who compress and by force so much of their pain and frustration? And I think that's just as true in different ways for Lenworth as it is for Plum.
Yeah, I think that all of us live lives like that. There are pieces of us who we that we show to some people, and there are other bits and pieces that we show to others. And some we, you might dance at home only when you're by yourself, or you might sing only in the shower, and nobody ever hears that. And so I think we all live like that. And in some ways, a lot of it really has to do with just the type of lives that we have, because you walk into work and you want to be this very professional person. And so your colleagues at work don't have any idea what it is that you do on a Saturday afternoon, or what you do on Sunday, what you were doing in the morning just before you showed up in the office. So I think we all compartmentalize our lives in so many different ways. And I think it's the same here, that for Plum and for Lenworth, they had to calculate what things they wanted to tell each other. Who would be the one who would either hold that secret or who would support that particular dream? How, understanding would Alan be if he understood exactly what Plum had gone through and what she was going to be going through? He would probably have looked at the relationship she had with the twin daughters very differently, had he understood, exactly why she, like, had these girls clinging to her, or she just would never let them out of her sight. But I think that, certainly what I try to do as a writer is to write about people who we all know, people we all see. And I think that the very things that each of these characters go through and do, I think, reflect exactly who we are as people and how we live our lives.
I think this is perhaps at the core of why I've seen so many folks this year cling to Tea by the Sea as a book they want to discuss with other people. Like there are
Yeah.
some books that feel like very interior experiences, and that's
Mm.
great. And then there are books like this one that you just are longing to share with your friends, with the people that you know, because you see fragments or shards of yourself or people you know and either love or do not love
Mhm.
and
Well,
want to share that with them.
right.
And so, Donna, as you know, we at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest have been running a campaign called the 100 Caribbean Books That Made Us. And for those of you who are not so familiar with the campaign, it began as a response to the BBC's list of 100 books that shaped our world. So I'm going to invite Donna at this point to share with us one or a couple or a few of the Caribbean books that have meant a lot to her?
Well, as a child, in high school, I guess I was lucky enough to go to high school at a time when we were reading some Caribbean literature. So I appreciated that then. I don't think I fully appreciated Caribbean literature until much later on. And one of the books that I read at a later time in my life was White Sargasso Sea, and it was one of those books that opened up so much about Caribbean and Caribbean literature for me at a time when I don't think I fully understood what Caribbean literature was or what Caribbean literature could do. Both the language itself, the nature of the story, the way in which the story itself was in conversation with the wider world. And I think a lot of that just really played out for me when I understood that the story was based on and I can't remember the British author's book, the
Jane Eyre.
Jane Eyre, right? So Antoinette was this mad woman in Jane Eyre who, was now in the Caribbean, taken out of her little place in the attic. And I think that story, or looking at it as a as a play off that of Jane Eyre, really puts it in conversation, or puts the Caribbean in conversation with the wider world. And I think for me, it was one of the first times where I really was able to look at a story based in the Caribbean and see how it fit in with everything else worldwide. And it's one of those books I go back to time and time again, partly because it's short, it's easy to read, but it talks about so much, like the history of how women were treated, agency, of course, um, um, slavery and the aftermath of slavery, colorism, as you mentioned earlier. Just about every issue that we have to deal with in the Caribbean is in that story, and I think it has shaped my outlook on the world in a lot of ways.
Donna, you could not know how perfect this answer is, because Why Sargassy is possibly, I think, my most beloved book of all time. So for the audience members who know this about me, no, I did not plant or prompt Donna to say this. This is as much of a wonderful revelation to me as it is to all of you. Yeah, I think any list that has or is talking about meaningful Caribbean books must have White Sargasso Sea,
Mhm.
at least for me,
Yeah.
very high up on it. So, and in our findings at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, what we have discovered is that there are many people who have the same response to that
Mhm.
particular book by Jean Reese, because we've released a preliminary list of the top or the most mentioned 24 titles, and White Sargasso Sea is among them.
Mm.
And this may have to do with the fact that so many of our students study it in the Caribbean year after year. But
Mhm.
I like to think it's because that particular book endures in what it means for us. And so
Right.
it's really lovely to hear those feelings echoed in your choice, Donna. Thank you for that.
Okay.
You've mentioned before that Opal has been one of the most difficult characters to write and to sit with in the writing of
Mhm.
Tea by the Sea. And I wanted, yes, for us to talk about that, but also to frame that in what for me were the very fascinating revelations of Opal's journals and diaries, and Opal's preoccupation with writing narratives of plays and movies in which she function as a savior and a
Mhm.
liberator of her own situation. So I'd love
Mhm.
for us to discuss that a bit.
Yeah, I think Opal was difficult for a number of reasons, and I think I wanted to tell this story from three perspectives, both Lenworth, Plums, and Opals, and I think it just became clear at some point that it really was a story, the parent story, and not really Opal's story. And what I needed to do was to use Opal as a way in which to show a lot more of Lenworth's flaws, as opposed to presenting her as a separate character with her own thoughts. Um, And so I think a lot of it really was that I also wanted, I think in order to show what Lenworth had done and how much his decision had really affected not just Plum, but his child, I had to present some aspects of Opal, both in what she was yearning for, what she was searching for, and what she was not at all getting from him. And the strongest role that I think Opal plays is really looking at how much she looked like her mother. And when Lenworth sees her, all he sees is his mistake.
Yeah.
And so there's no way that he can escape it. There's no way that no matter what he does, no matter what he tells himself, he will always be living with this mistake that he made. So I think it was difficult to write Opal as a, you know, whether using the first person or the third person to present that, because I couldn't put her in direct association or in direct situations with Lenworth because he was never looking at her. So I had to take her out of it and find different ways in which I presented her as a character, as this person who just simply reminded him of this big mistake of his life.
I mean, there are ways in which, even though the distance between Opal and
Mhm.
Plum for so long could not be greater, that these two characters hearken to each other across
Mhm.
the narrative. They're so moving to witness the ways in which they are the same, not just physically, and the
Right.
ways in which they're markedly different. And I feel that you are filling the landscape, the symbolic landscape of the book, with these clues and cues for how these two women might interact if they had a chance to be together.
Right. Mhm.
Course, without saying to readers of the book, who, if you have not read the book, you must do that. The big question of will they reunite? Read the book to find that out. But that you put those signposts in, like how important did it feel for you to make those
Mhm.
decisions?
I am not sure that I knew that that was what I was doing when I was writing it. You know, that's the thing is, you know, when you sit and have these kind of conversations with readers, there are things that come back to you and you begin to realize, oh yeah, you know, that happened. That, oh yeah, I meant to do that. You know, so I think that's one of those things where I don't know, like other than the actual tea by the sea portion of it, where Lenworth takes Opal to Coney Island as
Mm.
a ritual to have tea on her birthday, because that was something that Plum used to do, because she liked to have tea by the sea. And so she was, you know, like, Opal was then having that same ritual that her mother shared in without knowing that that was what she was doing. So I think they were speaking to each other there then, but I don't know. Oh, so outside of that, I don't know that I was aware of the ways in which I was, you know, like creating these parallel stories between the two. So, but I'm glad it's there. I'm glad you saw that.
It's all in there. And I encourage those of us who have not spent time with Tea by the Sea, you have to check those out. Like towards the end of the program, we will of course share publishers links. So you look out for those in our comment section. And please remember, this is 100% interactive. So please share your thoughts, your questions, your comments for Donna in the chat box in Facebook, and I will share them with her. But Donna, I think now is a good time to invite you to do your second reading for us, please.
Sure. So I'll read the second portion. I'll read takes place in Brooklyn when Plum believes she has finally figured out where Lenworth is. And so this is year 17, since her search is 17 years long. Brooklyn, East 33rd Street. The air was a little bit cooler and smelled of rain. Plum polished windows, both the inner and outer sides of the glass, with a crumpled newspaper and a mixture of vinegar, lime, and water. She whistled, thinking at the same time of the uselessness of her chore, polishing the exterior windows when rain had set up to fall. But she didn't stop, simply moved her arms like a wound up doll powerless to stop itself. Behind Plum were her girls, Nia and Vivian, 7-year-old twins, one doing cartwheels, the other watching, both girls lingering really and waiting for Plum to finish and turn to them. They were clingy girls, or perhaps it was the other way. Plum was an overprotective mother, preferring to have her girls with her, underfoot, within reach. Except for work, she didn't leave them. All these years, she hadn't been able to shake the fear that her girls wouldn't be there when she returned. But they were there, Nia, the acrobatic one, contorting her body through the air, and Vivian, a quiet observer with a book on her lap, stealing glances at Nia. Nia took risks. Vivian weighed consequences. Together, the girls balanced each other, and often, when Plum imagined them older, as teenagers, she saw Nia treating life like a tightrope and Vivian holding the net beneath her sister. Even if Alan had been home at that very moment, the girls would still have been nearby, waiting for her to finish and turn to them. Nia stumbled and crashed, and Plum turned to see her sprawled on the hardwood between the coffee table and the couch, water from a cup pooling, magazines from the rack scattered on the ground like shattered glass, and the storage bench flipped over on its side. You all right? Where did you hit? Did you hit your head? Nia, giggling instead of talking, looked at her sister and the pool of water spreading fast toward the rug. Vivian laughed too, their laughter loud, uncontrollable. Plum moved her daughter's shoulders and arms, watching for a wince, waiting for a shiver of pain, but again got only uncontrollable giggles. Enough of the cartwheels. She was trying to flip onto the bench and back down, Vivian said. Enough. Plum hadn't heard their discussion at all, hadn't heard the usual watch me. Plum shook her head, moved towards the spreading pool, newspaper in hand, and layered it on top of the water sheet by sheet, and drew her breath. It was a hiccup, really. She looked again, closer this time, back bent, water dripping from one half of the newsprint. She ripped the sheet in half, dropped the wet half to the floor, then moved toward the window for a closer look in the natural light. Unmistakable, Lenworth. She hadn't forgotten the face, the half smile, the thick brows, the thin nose. Below the photo, a caption with his name and title, Priest. Unmistakably him. Outside, the rain that had set up came with force, pummeling the plants that had withstood summer, and flooding the gutters and the nearly empty roads. The wind whipped the rain around, sprinkling raindrops against the windows like pebbles on glass. East 33rd Street was otherwise quiet, with everyone, it seemed, hunkered down, waiting out the mid-afternoon downpour in place. Plum waited out the rain just within view of her laughing, cavorting girls. She held the newspaper up, using the pages as a shield from the girls' gaze. At least for the moment, Nia had given up the cartwheels and handstands, and she sat with Vivian playing jacks. Behind the newspaper, Plum's calcified grief, all 17 years of it, broke apart. And tears, almost as fierce as the rain, dribbled down her cheeks, settling uncomfortably in the corners of her mouth. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that second reading. I mean, while you were sharing with us, I was reflecting on our thoughts about home and where Caribbean people find home. I think it's a lovely testament to the fact that while we were having that conversation, so many people from around the world were tuning in to this session. We have viewers from Trinidad, from the US, from Canada, and we have a couple of very lovely comments that I'd like to share with you.
Sure.
We have one from a Therese or Therese Russell, who says, I always liked when Donna read in literature classes in high school. I still do. I knew she'd be a writer one day. No surprise.
Hmm.
It's very lovely.
It is.
And that's definitely someone that you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a comment from someone who says that there are so many stories within Tea by the Sea that they loved it, and it is a wonderful book, which I completely agree with. I think I will actually use that question to
Mm-hmm.
ask from a craft perspective what it felt like, what it involved, trying to pack all these stories into each other, to spend time with thinking about how narratives would interlock. Because we have Plum's search for Opal that, as we know, spans 17 years. We have Lenworth's in mostly interior monologues and thought process with himself. Did you have to do a lot of mapping prior to writing the book as to how these journeys would intersect? Would paths cross? How would characters evade or meet up with each other on the page?
Mapping, no. So I'll step back a little bit and talk about how I came to write the story. So I had an idea to write a story about a group of people who went to a church and were locked in this church and refused to leave. And after I did that, but I still at that point didn't have any idea why they were there in that church. So the second piece of it was that sometime later I started writing a short section with a woman who was getting her daughters ready for school. She dropped them off at school, and instead of getting on the train and going to work, she started walking towards the church. And so then I knew who was in the church, but again, I didn't know why she was there. And so sometime after that, I happened to be in Jamaica, and there's a program that comes on the radio on Sunday evenings called Sunday Contact. And a woman called in because she was looking for her child. And what she said was that the child's father had taken the boy, and she didn't know where they were, whether they were in Jamaica, whether they were here in America, or where in the world they had gone. And so once I heard her desperate plea, I thought, this is the woman in that church. She's looking for her child, and she will refuse to leave until she figures out where that child is. So I started writing the story at that point where Plum is at that church. And so, which basically meant at that point that the story began in the 17th year. And so I wrote it, the very first draft, or maybe second draft, was written that way, where I knew I had to figure out and to explain to readers how we got to this point. So the story was told with a lot of backstory, a lot of looping back in order to explain how we got to Brooklyn from Jamaica. And so it wasn't until much later on where I realized that in order to tell the story, I couldn't tell it over a 24-hour period as I wanted, but I needed to take a step back and tell it over 17 years. And so that was, like a major change. But having to change it that way allowed me to tell the story a little bit differently, and to segment it in various pieces that formed Plum's life, or both of their lives together. The early years when she was, in the initial years when she was searching for both Plum and Opal, when she began settling in some ways to the life that she was going to have, but never letting go of what had happened in the past, to the point where she does figure out where he is and is in the story's, I guess, more present moment, trying to figure out how to, if possible, reunite with her child. So it's, I think in a lot of ways, the way I write, I don't necessarily map everything out beforehand, but as I start to write, various pieces of the story will reveal themselves, and I have to constantly figure out how to make those pieces fit. So it's almost like having a jigsaw puzzle with ends, and you have to make those ends fit. It's not that they come with the ends matching. You have to, snip and cut in order to make it fit. And, I wish that sometimes I wish that I wrote differently, but I think for me as a writer, the joy of writing that way is that I am learning as I go along. And that is the part that makes it just interesting and exciting for me. It's harder for me to write personal essays because I have already lived the experience. I know what happened. Whereas with fiction, I have to figure it out. And if I'm figuring it out and I'm interested and invested, then I figure my readers will be just as interested and invested in figuring out what happens in the story.
I love that. I love this idea. It's almost like a metaphor for a story that's like a living jigsaw puzzle. So it's not this neatly manicured thing,
Right.
this perfectly slotting into place jigsaw that we mentioned earlier on. Like you're not going to get that. You're going to get something that's much more vivid and visceral and organic. And like you're saying, there's a lot of joy, sometimes challenging joy,
Yes, sometimes challenging, yes.
in the process. And that's
Right.
the comment that we had about your colleague who read and found so many stories in Tea by the Sea is from Karen Paulson, who says,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
"Congratulations, my friend Donna. Karen P. from Barbados."
Yep.
We have a lovely comment from Carolyn Cooper saying, "Big up, Donna. Proud of you." It's
Oh,
lovely to see all of the love from around the
yeah.
world, from people who are in the Caribbean, geographically, emotionally,
Hmm.
in the diaspora, and otherwise. There's a comment from Angela D. Cuffy who says, "I haven't read the book yet, but enjoyed the reading. I like Protective Plum and the personality balance between Vivian and her twin sister. Congrats, we'll order the book."
Oh, good. Thanks.
I mean, you've spoken about the fact that agency is really critical to understanding why many of the characters in Tea by the Sea do the things they do, either as choices that they're claiming power from or in response to being robbed of agency. And then we see that so vividly in the ways that Plum is forced to respond to having her agency stripped from her. And I think that there is a way in which that agency ties in so closely to the secrets that we keep or are forced to keep or wish we could tell. I mean, if there is something that you'd like readers to understand better about their own agency as a result of having read the book, what do you think something like that would be?
I think when I think about agency, in relation to the book and in our lives in general, I think more about a lot of the things that are forced on us from, you know, colonial times, basically. So our lives, in some ways, we have shed some of that colonial baggage, but we still carry a lot of it with us in the ways in which we interact with, like our Caribbean dialects, in the ways in which we look at the foods that we eat, what we wear, when we wear it, what we tell women that they can and can't wear. And I think everybody in Jamaica will fully understand the idea that you cannot walk into certain places with your arms showing. Um, but a lot of that is comes from a completely different place when we as a people, like our entire culture was, determined and dictated by somebody else. And I think a lot of that filters down in so many of the actions that we continue to take today. And so I think in this story, what I wanted to do was not necessarily talk about colonialism and the issue of agency there on that broad level, but look at the ways in which it filters down to the rest of our lives. And I think here, this is exactly what we see, where Lenworth and like makes this momentous decision for Plum without having any conversation at all with her, and just completely disrupts her life, their daughters' lives, and even Pauline's life and the sons later on, because he's making a lot of decisions that I guess empower him, but without necessarily thinking about how any of those decisions and the actions that he takes affects the other people around him. And I think there's just so much of that is reflected in our history, in the ways in which there's so much of our culture and so many decisions that we could make was just simply erased and taken away from us.
Yeah, and it's to the credit of you and to the narrative that you also show that these decisions, the decisions that Lenworth takes, don't exist in a vacuum,
Hmm.
because you take us really generously into his past and the ways in which, again, without wanting to give too much away, in critical points in time in his development as a young person, that power was taken away from him, that decisions were made on his behalf, also tied to very colonial structures and how we
Hmm.
engage with those structures and in a post-colonial landscape, that nothing is happening by accident in this world.
Hmm.
And I felt
Yeah.
that was such a powerful reflection of how no engagement with power happens by accident in the real world itself.
Right, exactly. And I think in Lenworth's case, like certainly his decision was driven by that. His decision to take the child and to give Plum her freedom, it was all tied to what had happened to him as a child.
Mm.
And one of the things that we learn about Lenworth is that he had a dream to become an engineer.
Hmm.
And we see it when he's also in Coney Island, the ways in which he looks at different things, how he looks at the cyclone and how various things are built. But when he loses that opportunity as a child to finish his education and to have, like some of the money paid towards his education, he has to figure out how else he's going to move around in the world. And what he ends up doing, certainly is teaching, but even that is taken away from him, well, because of his own actions, but that's taken away from him. And he has to figure out what else is he going to do? So for Lenworth, he is moving from opportunity to opportunity, not necessarily moving towards the things that he wanted to do, but he's moving towards the things that are available to him. And I think for us, a lot of us, whether we're in the Caribbean or outside of the Caribbean, um, the, the things that we sometimes end up doing are the things that we end up with because those are the only options that we have at that point, as opposed to having the resources or having the opportunities to pursue the things that we want to pursue. And a lot of that, it's really, sometimes it's outside forces, sometimes it's because of our own actions in Lenworth's case. But I think that what is happening there is really in conversation with what else is happening in the wider world, that, we're all, the various interactions that we're having elsewhere.
Yeah, it's lovely to see that the wider world of our Facebook chat box is so full of love for Tea by the Sea, and rightly so. We have Julia Brown who says, "It's great to hear the underlying thought process from the perspective of the author. Congrats on your novel." We have Nicole Smith saying,
Hmm.
"I enjoyed River Woman and will definitely get this new book. Congrats, Donna." And I expect many people for their seasonal festivities in book reading will be curling up with Tea by the Sea. And I want to give a special shout out to everyone in the audience who has been so supportive and generous with their time in learning about the Caribbean books that are shaping our contemporary space. But before we go, our bios and bookmarks family know we can't let you leave without a very special game of read, write, and avoid. The premise for this game, for those of you new to it, is very simple. I'm going to present Donna with a scenario. Donna will tell us whether she would A, enjoy writing this thing, B, prefer to read it written by the hand of someone else, or C, avoid this thing altogether. So, Donna, are you ready for the scenario?
I am.
Great. So, the scenario is Donna by the Sea, a tell all memoir that exposes at least one deep secret of your life with a straight to Netflix adaptation. So, Donna, tell us, would you read, write, or avoid this?
I would want to read it. I certainly would love to see what somebody comes up with, what those secrets are. Um, not only what the secrets are, but like, I also certainly want to hear what other people would have to say, because I'm sure there's no way in which you could tell the story without talking to other people around me who might be interpreting things in different ways. So I am curious to hear that and to see it. I don't know if I'd want to watch it, but I want to read it. um, yeah, and I'm also curious, I guess, for the Netflix version, like who would be chosen to play me,
Uh,
and what aspect of my life would be on display. So
yeah,
now I'm just going to go live cleanly and make sure that there are no secrets.
make good decisions. That is a great answer. I think it's a perfect note on which to wrap up our conversation. I want to thank you so much, Donna, for being so generous and thoughtful with your readings and with our discussion. Thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And thank you also to all the listeners and for the great comments from Jamaica and from Barbados and wherever else they were. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thanks so much again to our audience for tuning in. Remember, there's one episode left of season 3 of bios and bookmarks powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramaluchan. Until I see you all again, please be safe and happy reading. Take care, everyone.